Remember these rules? Positive times a positive equals a positive. A negative, a positive times a negative equals a negative. I'm having to read backwards. A negative times a positive is a negative, and a negative times a negative equals a positive. Those are the 4 different ways that you could see a problem in multiplication. So why is that true? So let's think about this problem. I bet everybody knows that the answer is 21. And if you don't, we've just told you. So what I want you to start thinking about is, what does multiplication mean? Multiplication is really just repeated addition, and it's a faster way to do it. So this actually means of, and this means groups, and this is actually the number of groups, and this is the size of the groups. So I can say that this means I have 3 groups of 7, and in this case it's a positive 7. So what's another way I could write that? I could write this as 7 plus 7 plus 7, which we know equals 21. Makes perfect sense. Okay, so what about this one? 3 times negative 7. And oftentimes you're going to see the negative number in parentheses, not always, but a lot of times. So if we're thinking about the groups of and the size of the groups, this means 3 groups of negative 7. So again, this means of 3 groups of negative 7. So how would I write that sentence? Negative 7 plus negative 7 plus negative 7. And what would I get? Negative 21. So 3 groups of negative 7, I'm just repeatedly adding a negative 7, and I get negative 21. If I'm multiplying 3 groups of 7 that are both positive, I'm going to get 21 because it's 7 plus 7 plus 7. Now we're going to get to that other one. What if it looks like this? What if it says negative 3 times 7, where I have a negative times a positive, which is the opposite? Speaking of opposite, you've probably learned this in your math classes, that this has 2 meanings. When I read this problem, I'm going to say a negative 3 times a positive 7. Or I could say it's the opposite of this. So we're going to imagine that these have imaginary parentheses on them. So this actually means the opposite of 3 groups of 7. We already know what 3 groups of 7 is, which is 21. So what's the opposite? If this means the opposite of 3 groups of 7, so it'd be the opposite of 21. So this means the opposite of 3 groups of 7, because when you think about it, how do you have negative 3 groups? Doesn't make any sense. So instead, we're going to think about it like we do in our math class, and we're going to think about the other meaning, meaning the opposite of, and an imaginary parentheses around the rest of it, because we know it's the opposite of whatever's inside the parentheses. So if it helps you visualize this a little bit more, I'm going to turn those into actual parentheses. You probably can't see this. So again, this on the outside, when the problem says negative 3 times 7, it actually means not negative 3, but it means the opposite of 3 groups of 7, which I've written here. And the opposite of 3 groups of 7 is negative 21, because the 3 groups of 7 is actually 21. The opposite would be negative 21. So I bet you can kind of figure out where we're going next, which is, what if it starts out with, and this board is really bad, but we're going to use it anyway, negative 3 times negative 7. So what does this actually mean? Stop and think about it. Put in those imaginary parentheses. This is the number of groups, but we can't have negative 3 groups. So we're going to put in those imaginary parentheses, and it means the opposite of, can you guys still see this? I'm writing sideways. I can write upside down, but I didn't know I could write sideways. Okay, the opposite of 3 groups of negative 7. What did we already decide 3 groups of negative 7 was? Negative 7 plus negative 7 plus negative 7. That's going to give us negative 21. Well, what's the opposite of negative 21? 21. That's a horrible 2. Looks like a 4 almost. So we're going to cross that out and I'll write it so you can read it better. So the opposite of negative 21 is 21.